In contrast to W. Craig Baines, who came to exclusive Brethrenism as a fully formed adult, financially independent, socially secure, and intellectually mature, John Nelson Darby acquired, nurtured, and supported emotionally and financially two young men, the Grant brothers, whom he molded to his own specifications, almost. The Grant brothers were former priests in Canada of the United Church of England and Ireland, to use the formal but rarely employed title of the Anglican Church, who had become exclusive brethren shortly before Darby arrived in Canada. They were presented to Darby by Ralph Evans with the same pleased reverence that a returned warrior delivers a noble adversary to a conquering chief. Everyone in the Canadian Darbyite circle was delighted. Captain F. G. Scott, centre of the Quebec Assembly, wrote a long letter to a friend describing the joys of the 1862 autumn Guelph meeting. Among other spiritual wonders, two clergymen, Frank and Robert Grant, who 2 months since sent in their resignation to their bishop, the Bishop of Huron, were present and full of solemn joy. They intend taking a few pupils each and devoting the rest of their time to preaching and visiting among the saints. At that same Guelph meeting, the older brother, Frank, joined Ralph Evans in preaching to the Guelph townspeople from a small island in the river that ran through Arthur Wells's property, and it was a triumph. Frederick William Grant, 1834 to 1902, was destined to become a big figure in exclusive brethren history. According to Dr. Harry Ironside, in America, F. G. Grant had become by 1880 the leading figure among the exclusive brethren, and his younger brother Robert, born 1836, became a pioneer, almost a founder of the exclusive mission in California. The brothers' trajectory between their birth in Kensington, London, and their late-life missionary achievements was not epic, more just making the best of mediocre luck. The brothers were remarkably close all their lives, and they never were far apart in their careers, beliefs, or religious practices. Frederick, and I strongly suspect Robert, had been sent to King's College School, Wimbledon, London, to prep for a career in the War Office, a nice, safe, modest, plum-for-life entry achieved by patronage. According to Samuel Ridout's profile of Frederick, the necessary influence for this failing, he went to Canada. Actually, Frederick and Robert emigrated together, arriving in the port of New York on the Maid of Orleans in mid-October 1855, and their younger sister Frances came later. The brothers' emigration is somewhat more ambiguous than the lack of patronage explanation suggests. Their father, Frederick John Robert Grant, was a fund holder, meaning a gentleman who lived on the interest of what were usually low-yield bonds. One needed to be fairly highly capitalized to live adequately while dependent on such a source. Sometime in the 1840s, the boy's mother died, and in 1848, their father married an Emma Bishop, moved residence, took in his new wife's sister, and started a second family. Perhaps, indeed, as the family story suggests, the patronage for a civil service appointment for Frederick, and by inference for Robert later, fell through, and that is why the lads left England. Perhaps the patron who withdrew support was their father. In any case, the young men emigrated. In settling in Canada, Frederick and Robert Grant were gentlemen in a raw land. Not surprisingly, they gravitated to southwestern Ontario, Toronto, London, Hamilton, where their sort of person, good-mannered, unwilling to do manual labor, and able to convincingly pass off Latin gobbets, had a chance of finding a suitable living. The Grants were not snobs. Their adaptability as missionaries proved notable, but they were not going to be farmers. Frederick messed about on the fringe of medicine, most likely homeopathy. Perhaps surprisingly, the two lads decided to be priested. However, this was not preposterous, for the Church of England, even more than most colonial denominations, needed clergy. Just before the Grant brothers arrived, the Anglican Church as an institution in Canada had completed its transition to a voluntary church, possessing no state power, accepting no direct state interference, and cut off from governmental money. This last proviso was the one that opened jobs. From 1791 to 1854, the Church of England had received funds in varying degrees from the clergy reserves lands, originally equal to 1/7 of the public lands of Quebec and Ontario. These endowments, having been rearranged and reduced in several stages, were abolished in 1854, with, however, protection for life interests of the clergy. They would be paid for life, and if they were devoted, they could choose to have their life interests given to the Incorporated Church Society and themselves run the risk of having to take a reduced stipend. In practical terms, this meant that there were two sorts of Anglican parishes in Ontario: those whose clergy had some level of lifetime financial security, and those, either new benefices or ones left empty by retirements, where financial compensation was considerably less certain. Thus, jobs for the Grant boys. They finally had some good luck. They were young, hovering around the canonical age of 24. They had no university degree or equivalent training, and for that matter, there is no evidence of their possessing anything more than the functionally necessary respect for institutional religion. Still, they had received a decent education at a good school. They could write grammatical sentences, and they spoke well enough so that they would not be an embarrassment in public. Good enough material for Benjamin Cronin, 1802 to 1871, Bishop of Huron. Cronin, in mid-1857, had won a hard-fought election to become the inaugural bishop of, effectively, southwestern Ontario, a see created out of the Diocese of Toronto. Note the word, election. A statute of 1857 had completed the voluntarization of the Anglican Church by cutting the last state-dictated limitations on its independence. Bishops in Canada were to be elected by synods of the clergy and leading laity, rather than being appointed from Canterbury. In some ways, then, it was a very good time to be an Anglican clergyman in southern Ontario. Full denominational independence posed real challenges, but yielded unprecedented freedom of action. Bishop Cronin's new-hewn diocese began with 39 functional parishes with 80-plus congregations, and thus with multiple charge benefices, hard to serve, a quickly growing population, and 100 empty parishes. He recruited vigorously. One of his immediate tactics, almost a desperation measure, was to take on presentable persons and ordain them quickly, without any formal university or seminary education. For Cronin, they had to be low church and preferably evangelical. Frederick and Robert Grant fit, and both were ordained. In the 1861 census, one finds Frederick recorded as the Reverend F. W. Grant, clergyman C.V., in Paris, Ontario. Robert was a curate serving on the Grand River Reserve. Here briefly, I wish to extract the two lads still, they were so very green, from the contemporary Brethren judgment concerning their becoming Church of England priests, that the Grants took a splayed and wasteful path, and were rescued from their willfulness by their conversion to Darbyism. Whatever the supernal value of their conversion, they had been on promising career paths in the expanding Anglican sphere in southwestern Ontario. That said, one must also recognize that one reason they did well as Brethren missioners was that they had been apprenticed in the Church of England and had learned how to conduct public worship, to project pastoral presence, and presumably they learned basic theology, largely evangelical and Calvinistic, as was strongly preferred by Bishop Cronin. One would like to know what their spiritual training under the bishop actually was. Firm and fatherly in any case. Without reaching, Benjamin Cronin, Bishop of Huron, has to be built into the largely unknown narrative of the exclusive brethren in central Canada, especially because of an unexpected but compelling parallel. Benjamin Cronin was a within the Anglican Church doppelganger of John Nelson Darby, who was, of course, outside that same church. The two men were of almost the same age, born 1800 and 1802 for Darby, Cronin respectively, hereditary members of the Anglo-Irish ruling class, Queen's County, County Kilkenny, attended Trinity College, Dublin, B.A., 1819 and 1822, were ordained in Ireland, deacon, 1825 in both cases, Darby priested 1826, Cronin, 1827, both briefly in charge of an Irish parish, and both left Ireland in response to the troubles of the Church of Ireland and in essence served as lifelong missionaries. Darby to the continent in 1837 and thereafter always in motion, Cronin emigrating to Canada in 1832 in a widely publicized group flit involving several upper-class families who chartered their own transatlantic vessel, and in Upper Canada grafted themselves on to the Canadian ruling class. There is no question that John Nelson Darby and Benjamin Cronin knew of each other from their early 20s onward. Cronin's theology, like Darby's, was Calvinistic, evangelical in the Irish meaning of the term, and acerbically opposed to anything that hinted of Romish influences in Christian worship. The Canadian champion of pure low church Anglicanism, Cronin fought his corner with a vigor and a disinhibition that must have impressed even Darby. Cronin's 1860s war against Trinity College, Toronto, as allegedly being unsound and un-Protestant, was so disruptive that it had to be referred to a special conclave of the bishops of British North America. In an exercise in counterfactual reflection, one might see Cronin as the colonial bishop that Darby would have become had he remained a sturdy, restive, and aggressively evangelical Church of Ireland clergyman. The point concerning Frederick and Robert Grant is that they were trained, quite unintentionally, for Darbyism by the one Anglican prelate in the entire Second British Empire who most closely approximated John Nelson Darby in temperament and cultural background, and whose theology was very little changed from the beliefs that Darby himself had left in the 1830s. In other words, Cronin put the young men on virtually the same low church doctrinal and liturgical plinth that Darby had abandoned as a young man, and the path to Darbyism from that hummock was well marked and easily accessed. In August 1862, shortly before John Nelson Darby arrived in Canada, the Grant brothers had written a joint letter to Bishop Cronin resigning their positions in the Church of England and separating from it entirely. It was a good letter, clear, tactful, and spiritual, without being self-righteous. The Grant brothers undeniably were sincere in their conversion to exclusive brethrenism, and one can hardly deny the authenticity of this fairly long, circa 1,800 words, prose piece. Still, it has the tone of a student essay that has been polished by a hovering tutor. From an extended sample of Frederick's writing, a 22-page printed pamphlet he wrote in 1868, it is clear that well into his 30s, he could not write persuasive and smooth religious prose. And here we should recall that the Grant brothers had a tutor in Ralph Evans, the missionary who presented them as trophy converts to Darby. With those observations in mind, the way the letter to Bishop Cronin works is admirable. It begins with a seductive hook, a slice of dialogue, a technique frequently employed in brethren tracts of the period, for example, those of C.S. Stanley. My dear Lord, 6 months ago, we should have considered it the merest impossibility that we should have ever been compelled to address your lordship in the way we are at present doing. About that time, one of us was accosted by a very earnest Christian friend upon the subject of church government, and in answer to the remark, "I would rather speak upon things about which we agree than upon those in which we differ," he replied, "Yes, that is true, but we should not be afraid of discussing any point whatever." The answer was, "I am not afraid, because I am convinced the Church of England stands upon so scriptural a base that nothing can shake it." The result was our receiving at one time or another some such little tracts as those we send your lordship. Not actually ripping yarn dialogue, but this was a letter of resignation from religious office and of personal separation from a specific faith. And instead of barging into the bishop's study and slamming a handwritten document on his desk, the Grant brothers were quietly inviting the bishop to understand why they were leaving. The latent content is very much, "Come now, and let us reason together, saith the Lord." Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18. But those little tracts, well, the arguments were new to us, and the whole subject was treated in a different way from anything we had seen before. We examined, re-examined, read, and prayed over them. All our professions were against them. We had every reason almost to wish them untrue. Yet we are obliged to confess they have triumphed over every opposition. The Grant brothers had self-converted to exclusive Brethrenism. The conversion process, as they present it, is almost an ideal type of the Darbyite evangelical process. The Grants feasted spiritually on the published thoughts of literary messengers. The exclusive brethren in the British Isles produced a torrent of publications, way out of proportion to their own numbers. Secondly, the Grant brothers' reported conversion was dependent not upon any revivalist figure, but upon the young men's inwardly wrestling with the big issues, just as John Nelson Darby himself had done while laid up in County Wicklow in the late 1820s after an accident. In their dealing with Bishop Cronin, the story, basically accurate, had the virtue of saying that no one from the Brethren community in the diocese was to blame. They had self-converted. Basically accurate, yes. But of course, reality frequently has less polish and dignity than does written story. From an independent source, there comes a rougher version. The writer was John Reed, deceased 1994 or 95, a lifelong stalwart of the branch known as the Grant Exclusives. He knew Frank, the son of F.W. Grant, and Frank told him concerning F.W.'s conversion to Brethrenism that in addition to serving as an Anglican minister, his father was also practicing medicine in Canada at that time and became a steady customer at a local drugstore owned and operated by a Christian who was in the assemblies. He had pamphlets, written by J.N. Darby and other early brethren, on display in his store and available to any who desired them. On reading these pamphlets, Grant received further light on the Scriptures, and soon took his place among the brethren. Aside from the fact that by century's end, F.W. Grant was leader of a collectivity of 100 or more assemblies of Grant Exclusives in North America, the information on the conversion of the Grant brothers merits attention because it illustrates some cautions that are needed when reading conversion literature of any faith, not just those of Christian evangelicalism. First, real conversion stories are scarce, ones that have flat, factual reporting and mise-en-scène. Instead, most conversion tales are used either as sales pitches to new adherents or, alternately, as justification for the way someone acts after conversion. In either case, they are items of artifice. That does not mean that they are mendacious, merely that they are a genre. Each branch of evangelicalism has had its own private rhetorical form, and these naturally have varied over time. We can appreciate the form in each case, but must continually remind ourselves that it is an inaccurate and therefore sadly inadequate reflection of what and how an individual was turned inside out. The Grant brothers continued their letter to Bishop Cronin by covering substantive matters of faith, particularly the nature of Christian ministry and of group worship, but they resisted the temptation to stride away as momentary heroes, as if they had nailed their theses to a cathedral door. With wisdom that I suspect came in some portion from Ralph Evans, they wrapped their hard-edged doctrinal conclusions in sentiments that register as genuine. They told Bishop Cronin that the ties of gratitude for much well-remembered kindness will not be severed soon, nor shall there ever be disunited the common bond that in infinite mercy has linked our soul to the unseen beloved. And to close amiably and cleanly a relationship that had been closely personal and also professional, we anxiously await your lordship's reply, that we may know in what way the necessary separation can be effected with the least inconvenience or difficulty to yourself. They concluded with affectionate respect, which is a fair summary. They liked, perhaps loved Cronin in a son-father sense. So different was this entire transaction from the standard separation, an in-house term among the exclusive brethren, referring to an action that usually was so harsh and mechanical as to be an industrial term, that one has to ask, what did John Nelson Darby think about the Grants' separation letter? Here Darby indicated that he understood that sometimes some of the old patterns had to be moderated. Two brothers, both clergymen who were on the move, have come out, Darby wrote to a Canadian friend not long after his own arrival in Canada. From all I have seen of them, our beloved brethren, their letter to the bishop was very nice. Nice. Arthur Wells, Craig Baines, Frederick Grant, Robert Grant, and Ralph Evans. They were not mere pit ponies, not even the young Grants. None of them was limited to working in a single assembly, or even to a multi-assembly city. Each traveled in response to direct communications of need from fellowships, sometimes hundreds of miles away. These men were something like sales team leaders for a product that was not divided on territorial lines. Everybody overlapped. The brethren leaders always were men, based, they believed, on a biblically derived imperative. They encouraged, and sometimes founded, local fellowships, advised on doctrine, enforced discipline, and stitched together clusters of local assemblies, so that, like the winter sky coming out from behind an ice fog, the empty space around the Great Lakes Basin was gradually replaced by a necklace of tiny faith communities. Certainly, each of these individuals responded directly to the desires of John Nelson Darby, and more important, assimilated his beliefs and methods to the point that they were part of their own religious personalities. Even Arthur Wells, before he spun out of Darby's gravitational field. These men were Darbyites, no doubt about that. But the exclusive brotherhood that Darby created in the New World in the mid-Victorian era was somewhat less restrictive, less given to tong wars over tiny doctrinal and administrative differences than in the homeland, if for no other reason than that comparatively large physical distances and a much more fluid social structure made the enforcement of complete cult unanimity impossible. The men we have been paying attention to as individuals in this chapter are among the few in North America in the mid-Victorian era who have left a deep enough archival trail to allow our gaining a realistic sense of them as full human beings, not merely pallid footnotes to their tracts and fly sheets. For each of the men here, there were 10 or a dozen full-sized figures, active all around the Great Lakes Basin, who have left behind their names, and little more. Here we return to the Grant brothers, Frederick and Robert. They are especially instructive because they constitute the only nicely documented case that I have encountered that shows John Nelson Darby as a mentor and protector of future leaders in North America, men who carried on when he was absent in Europe or the British Isles, and soldiered on after his death in 1882. They are quiet, unassuming men, one married with a baby, the other not, he wrote, referring to Frederick, who had recently married, and Robert. The married one has taken a house here, hoping he may have some boys to help support himself, though anxious not to put himself out from working. Right there was the perpetual problem for any one of the brethren, who was, like Darby, given to full-time service, but who, unlike him, was not independently wealthy. Frederick planned to support a family by tutoring and would need an occupation that was not too demanding. Soon, in a fatherly fashion, Darby started to worry about how the lads would support themselves. Hitherto they have been kept without need. Their habits are very simple. One, this is Robert, used to the bush and simple, so that his living costs very little indeed. He has just gone off to the wildest parts. The other is married and necessarily spends more. Frederick moved to Toronto, still trying to find paying pupils, and Robert stayed in the bush, a missionary and some sort of factotum. For quite a time, neither one had received the arrears of his Church of England work, and Darby apparently had mentioned this to Wigram, who sent help. The money has been most timely for the Grants, Darby told Wigram. The single one is away up in the bush, working away, and happily. The other also had never received his arrears from his parish, but now has got quite clear of all he owed, and has something to go on with. Darby passed on £25 to Robert in the bush, and £35 to Frederick in Toronto. 6 months later, Robert was living with another of the brethren on the Six Nations Reserve. Having a mechanical turn tries his hand at watchmaking, Darby judged. He feels it an evil not to have his time filled up. A month after that, he had moved to Collingwood, and was keeping the books of a very kind and true-hearted brother, who will not only leave him free to work there, but to go away when called elsewhere for a time. As for elder brother Frederick, Darby was concerned that he had small physical energy, and therefore was mooting a situation where Robert would do most of the money-making work, and Frederick would have his time free for spiritual efforts. That remained only an empty plan. But Frederick, valetudinarian still, his strength is not great, was set up in a profitable tutoring post for Sir J. Robinson's son. By the mid-1860s, Frederick was based in Toronto, running a Brethren bookstore on Yonge Street with Sister Fanny, Frances, who lived with him and his family, in the mix. Robert, single and mobile, was all over the place, but his first love was the Indian mission. The brothers never became self-supporting. Darby and others in England frequently sent money, and continued their mixture of not very remunerative gentlemanish jobs. Frederick asserts his occupation as gentleman in the 1871 census, interspersed with lots of missionary travel, often to the United States. In the 1870s, Frederick, in an effort at becoming self-supporting, tried to make his previous unofficial efforts at medical practice professional, at least to the extent of fully qualifying as a homeopath. He would set up a practice and try to pass the examinations, should his own health permit. He studied, or apprenticed, in Buffalo, New York for a time, and was getting into practice, but it all came unstuck, and he returned to Toronto and took up the old work at the book depot. The financial support and life management counseling John Nelson Darby gave to the Grant brothers was indispensable. Missionaries have the same mundane needs as everyone else, but his great gifts were tutoring them in doctrinal discipline and providing spiritual counsel when they were dispirited. And here one speaks of the brothers as a single entity. They were very close to each other all of their lives, and in the letters each sends to Darby are newsy bits from each about the other brother, the kind of details that are the chaff of their writing to each other constantly. I mention that since Frederick's life was more fully recorded than was Robert's, because he became head of a large tranche of American exclusives, the Grant exclusives. The best indication of the success of Darby's doctrinal tutorship of the two men is that they drew his anger only once, and that was shortly before his death in 1882. They preached, taught, and published, but all within the lines he laid down. One finds many instances in Darby's collected letters of his answering doctrinal queries and giving advice on pastoral behavior according to the exclusive brethren rubrics. By the mid-1860s, the Grant brothers had become dependably useful. Darby could confidently write to a saint that the Grants are working diligently. R. Grant at Quebec, Frederick has been at Port Burwell, on the north shore of Lake Erie, where there has been inquiry. As mentioned earlier, in 1868, Frederick did Darby good service by writing a Canadian riposte to an attack by a senior Irish Wesleyan Methodist minister concerning lay preaching, which of course was the fundamental human conduit of the Brethren's delivery of truth. The booklet was no masterpiece, but it defended the flag. Frederick thereafter could be counted on to reply to Darby's critics when they circulated perceived contumelies in the Canadas. For example, his 1877 response to criticism of the Darbyite view of the Second Coming. And both brothers could be relied on to provide a constant feed of information about individuals and assemblies, triumphs and scandals, and Darby, as he grew to trust them, responded by mixing a fair amount of chat along with his spiritual advice. Still, doctrinal training, job counseling, practical suggestions for pastoral success were not the entire bundle, and Darby's power as cult leader hinged on his ability to levy emotional dependence upon his followers. The men we have been sketching in this chapter were prototypes of the assorted folk who became Darbyite missionaries all around the Great Lakes Basin. Rarely do we see the contrails of Darby's emotional influence. In large part, it was effected in personal counseling, individual prayer sessions, and in the mystical experience of brethren bread-breaking. The two Grant brothers left rare sets of letters to Darby, rare. Mostly only those from him survive in various correspondences, and most are filleted or emotionally costive. And these let us see what followers brought to Darby privately, as in the confessional. Here are a few examples of such intimacies and servilities, excerpts from Grant brothers' letters, representative, I believe, of the hundreds and hundreds of quiet encounters, unrecorded, that exclusive brethren had with their leader. From Robert Thomas Grant, Darby heard that, 1863, I have a great desire to be of some service to God's people, but see so little ability to serve them, though I know that all the power is Christ's. And then so much that needs correction in myself, often such coldness and, illegible, wariness, it makes me feel as if the Lord could scarcely use me. But yet his strength is made perfect in weakness. 1866. Nothing is so helpful as to get a knowledge of the root things spring from. Satan so often appears as an angel of light. What you say about being engaged with Christ himself is very meet and just. Nothing else can really feed the soul. 1873. This constant change from place to place unfits for communion with God. Learning everywhere the failure of God's people is very depressing until one has learnt to be with God about it all. I am sure, dear Mr. Darby, that there is a pretty low state of things amongst us generally. So many things are tolerated now that once would have been judged and put away. The following is from Frederick William Grant to Darby, 1864. I know still so little of the power of truth, which yet I have a long time and more than outwardly embraced. My knowledge of resurrection life is even yet, as one now at least fully knowing it expressed it, as of a bright light seen from afar rather than attainment. 1867. I am in that state that I can easily believe indeed that others can judge me better than I can myself. I would be glad for you to know me fully. Strange to say, if there is one thing I do seem to realize most, it is my worthlessness. Write to me freely. Rebuke me where I need it. I covet true and faithful dealing, and even if it were not so, surely you would give it to me. That last letter contained 5 full pages of self-disparagement.